Today, we begin with the Hebrew Scriptures, verses more familiar to us in the context of harvest and thanksgiving, but providing us with a summary of the story of God's promise to Israel after 40 years of desert wandering. There are many ways of reading this text. One is to use it for power and possession, but this morning, on this first Sunday in Lent, let us consider that all the land we travel across belongs to God, that God is in it and is with us. It is a wonderful story of thanksgiving, celebration, and blessing, and a timely reminder for us as we emerge from COVID restrictions that we too have a story to celebrate and share. Deuteronomy reminds us that God's generosity and our retelling of the story, corporate and individual, culminates in both giving back to God and reaching out to others. The grace received becomes the grace shared, particularly among those who feel they do not belong. The power of this celebration appears to be to take stock, to see the provision of God, rejoice in it, and then recognize the source of all things, God. And in recognizing God as source, provider, lover, and giver of life, respond with generosity, bringing our first fruits of love, friendship, support, offering our gifts, reminding ourselves of where we have come from, where we have been brought to, and how God has sustained us. But rather than exulting in self-satisfaction, remembering the landless and the strangers among us, practicing hospitality and welcome, openness and generosity. And we are reminded that despite our wanderings and waywardness, God remains faithful. His grace is sufficient. This idea of journey is important. The promised land, flowing with milk and honey, was that the end of the journey for the people of Israel all those years ago? Of course not. Life changes and evolves. Our own lives, the life of our churches, the life of the groups to which we belong, the life of nations and of the world. And the question, surely a Lenten one, must be, are we up for this journey? Are we ready? What do we need to carry with us? What sustains us? Keep all this in mind as we turn to the Gospel and Luke's account of the temptations in the wilderness. I can remember as a child suddenly stopping in my tracks, head buzzing and thinking, who am I? What is this life about? Why am I here? Is this really me? I can also remember how over the years, significant moments have caused me to pause, to reevaluate, to rethink, to take stock of life, its meaning and purpose. I suspect we all have such moments. Moments when things change and afterwards nothing is the same again. And yet the implications of this takes time to understand. Is this how it was for Jesus after his baptism? We are told that he was led by the Spirit in the wilderness, where for 40 days he was tempted by the devil. Was Jesus wondering about his identity and purpose? Is this where he will begin to understand the kingdom, the shalom he is called to build in the hearts and minds of people? 40 days alone in the wilderness takes Jesus to the limits of his physical endurance and strength. He struggles with temptation and faces the reality of evil, but this time and space also becomes a place of clarity, which shapes the pattern and purpose of his ministry. Luke places this story between Jesus' baptism by John and the start of his ministry in Galilee. Have you ever wondered how Luke knew about what happened out there in the desert? I have a picture of Jesus sitting on the hillside one day, his friends around him, describing this hard time, using the language of metaphor to explain the real choices he had to make. Clearly, it was a struggle, and the choices were as real for Jesus then as they are for us today. 3 temptations, 3 points. Notice the subtleties. If you are the Son of God, then prove it. Prove it by turning stones into bread. Prove it by leaping from the temple roof to impress people. Prove it by bowing down before the throne of power, greed, and popularity, making them the signs of your kingdom. But secure in his identity and assured of his Father's love, Jesus resists these temptations and holds fast to his calling. On this, the first Sunday in Lent, we too are invited to pause, take stock, and reflect on our own priorities. We are invited to let go of our anxieties, our agendas, and lack of contentment, and rethink what is important to us. Our Christian faith is a gift waiting to be explored and enjoyed and shared. It is not a carefully packaged set of religious rules and rituals. No wonder we talk about thinking outside the box. Neither is it like a set of religious plates we desperately keep spinning in the air. Rather, it is about God opening us up to a place within our minds and hearts where we can face ourselves and be released from the fears which entangle us, and where we can listen and hear the gentle whisper of God's love saying, "You are my child, whom I love." This is the paradox of the desert as Jesus reveals from his own experience. The barren and unpromising desert turns out to be a place of discovery, of growth, and of freedom. Last week, I shared an event in Leeds called Movement for Recovery and Change. We reflected on the past 2 years, on our losses, isolation, anxieties, our weariness. How do we move on as we ease out of these restrictions? What have we learnt? How do we use this newfound knowledge? COVID-19 has changed us. What next? Are we listening for God's voice in the messiness of our everyday lives? Fuel, poverty, debt, climate change, racism, power, slavery, truth, integrity, forgiveness, compassion, love. Where do we stand on these issues? We are weary and preoccupied with many things. Could it be that, like Jesus, we need to embrace the wilderness? Could it be that instead of trying to give something up for Lent, we should open hearts and minds to receive? I left my computer screen, yes, it was a Zoom conference, encouraged, as together we shared the ways our God had sustained us, how we had supported and cared for one another, how we had discovered new ways to keep in touch and even got to know one another better, reaching out far beyond our church walls. How timely that we are now in the season of Lent. Can this Lent be for us, as for Jesus, a season for inner reflection and deeper faith, a time to face the fears that overshadow us, a time to welcome change and move on with a renewed confidence? Which takes me back to where we began. God is with us on our journey. So with all people, with all God's people of every age and place, let us give thanks and praise to him. Amen.